We're in our series, A Follower of Jesus, and we answered the question, what is a Christian? Or we asked the question, what is a Christian? And we kind of gave some answers. We've been looking into that, but really, ultimately we said that maybe that's actually not the best question. Maybe that's not the thing that we need to be asking or concerned with or even looking at. Maybe there's something that's different. And in our first week, we said that Jesus wasn't concerned with converting people to Christianity. He was passionate about people following him in faith. As a matter of fact, Jesus didn't use the term Christian. That wasn't an identifying marker. That wasn't a label that he used. And I'm sure all of us understand at some level the term Christian can get really muddy. But Jesus used the term disciple or follower, and that became crystal clear. And so the next week we looked at last week that these followers of Jesus, these disciples, they had a sincerely held belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And we kind of celebrated that a few weeks ago at Easter. And we said that this was a big part of what they believed because it wasn't that Jesus was a good person who died and then he was just gone. It was, no, he died and he rose from the dead. And this is what separated him and proved that he was who he said he was. And that was not just the way to God, but that he was God. And that was their sincerely held belief, was the resurrection. But they had this driving ethic of love. Their behavior was centered around love. And based on this life and love model, we said that following Jesus is about a better way to live life and to love others. And we began to kind of switch the question around, and we asked this new question that was simply this: how should I love? If I follow Jesus, the question, the thing that boils down to isn't even what's my worldview, what are my politics, what are my thoughts on these. It really boils down to this question that each of us who follows Jesus can ask. And I would say that if we all ask this, if we follow Jesus or not, it's certainly going to help us get better at life, is how should I love? Right? How should I love in this certain situation, with this particular person, with my time, with my money? How should I love? And imagine if our days and our weeks and our months and years were driven by this question of how should I love? And we said that Jesus told his disciples that the identifying marker that they actually followed him would be how they loved each other, because of the way he loved them. And it's really, if you're a follower of Jesus, this should be your goal and your driving force, is how do I love people? How will people know that I follow Jesus? Is by the way that I love. And so then that brings us to this week, kind of our conclusion. We're gonna wrap it up, and I'm sure this conversation certainly isn't over. We could continue it for sure, but as far as our discussion gatherings, we're gonna wrap it up today, and it leads us to New York City, 1974. I was born, just kidding. It's not me, no. Now, 1974, New York City, below the Twin Towers, the streets screeched to a halt because 110 stories high on a 130-foot tension cable, Philippe Petit was balancing on a high wire above the city streets, 110 stories. And it rang out over the police scanners, man on wire at the World Trade Center. And basically, Philippe Petit and his team had broken into the World Trade Center with all of the equipment necessary. They got up to the very roof, and then at the time of daybreak, right when he wanted to, they had this cable stretch, and they fought through injury. He literally stepped on a nail at one point. One of their team members, right at the last minute, quit and was like, I'm out of here. I don't want to get arrested. And through all these troubles and security guards and all these things, there's a wonderful documentary on it. There's also a movie that was made about it recently. It's this really just exciting story of this guy getting out onto this wire and doing what probably no one else in the world would be willing to do or even able to do. And he actually walked this wire back and forth, and the police helicopters are above him, and police end up on either side of the building, but they couldn't touch him because they're not willing to go out onto the tension line. And so he at one point, he has a long pole, he kneels down on one knee on this wire, and he puts the pole across, and he bows to the people below 110 stories, and at one point he laid down on this wire. And it's this amazing story of this guy who was willing to live life, as he describes it, on the edge. And I would say he was willing to live life in the in-between, in that scary, dangerous, risky place that he had prepared his entire life to be, and to actually lay down in this bliss of this is where I'm supposed to be. And it was in the middle of the tension. And I love that story because I think it connects to something that Jesus leads us to if we follow him. Now, maybe you're like, I'm not a follower of Jesus, and so maybe that kind of turns you off a little bit. I think that the tension we're going to talk about today is actually good for everybody, right? It can help us all engage with people better. It could help us all live better and love better. But if you follow Jesus, it's kind of the thing that he's leading you into, right? That if you say that Jesus is leader and Lord of my life, this is the place that you will go if he is truly leader and Lord of your life. And again, if he's not, I encourage you to listen in. And because I think you could get better at some things as you engage in life. But first, I want a few thoughts on tension. So there's a man by the name of Reggie Joiner. He's a wonderful leader that I just really respect. And I listened to a talk of his at an event a few years ago. And honestly, this talk was one of the things that sparked the idea of this kind of gathering right here. His talk on tension is one of the things that motivated me that the church could engage the world in a different way. And so I want to share some thoughts of his he had on tension, and then we're going to kind of move into what Jesus gives us as an example of this. So first off, some thoughts on tension. Sometimes in an effort to embrace what's true, right? And maybe people who call themselves Christians and people in the church, the truth. That's what they want, right? And in an effort to embrace what's true, we forget to embrace the tensions that connects these truths to what is real. Because most of us have been in a church setting of some sort or been around a Christian of some sort. And like when you go to church and maybe they're doing a discussion on family, they give you this wonderful ideal family scenario. And then maybe everyone in the church, all the families, try and at least look like they're that kind of family when they come to church. Right? Or they look like that's the kind of life they lead, at least when they come to church. And they come to church very inauthentically because at home, and most of us, and maybe you grew up in that, and you realize, like what we are at church isn't the real life that's Monday through Saturday. This Sunday has become this whole other thing, and the church was actually guilty of not connecting God's maybe ideal truth or best practices or wisdom to what people are really going through in life, because we all know that all of our families, in some way or another, get messy. And that the ideal family probably doesn't exist. And maybe you saw that Sunday you tried to be something that your family wasn't the rest of the week, and that turned you off because there was no tension. There was this over here and there was this over here, and the real and the ideal never met and they never connected, and the truth of God was never connected to what you were really living in. And that's just one example. And so I think it's important for the church especially to connect what is real and what is ideal to people. Next, tension doesn't make truth less true, it makes it more real. And again, this is one of the things that when we're willing to step out into that dangerous area, right, where it's not we're standing on this side over here, we're not staying on this side over here, but we're willing to kind of move towards a center into that tension and live in this tension, it actually makes the truth that we espouse, that we profess, it makes it more real in our life and in the way we practice our beliefs. And so it's incredibly, incredibly important that that truth and tension exist together. And then next, if we don't embrace tension, we set people up to reject what is true because of what they will experience. And I'm willing to bet, if maybe this is your first time in a long time in a church, that this is a big part of why you just couldn't reconcile God and life. Church, organized religion, and real life and experiences that you were having in your life. And so tension's important. The church does itself a disservice if in our culture, especially in our current culture, if pastors and people who follow Jesus aren't willing to go out into that tension, to the dangerous area, to the risky place, and prepare to do what it takes to meet people where they are and to actually connect the truth to what is real. So, now let's look at what that tension in a very specific area as it comes to Jesus. So one of his disciples, John, he wrote the gospel account. It's basically a biography of Jesus according to John's experience, right? And so he's writing the stories that he thinks are important, and he's writing the themes that he thinks are important. And John was especially close to Jesus. He referred to himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. Now, he was the only one that referred to himself that way, but so maybe they all felt that way, but like that's how he wrote it out in his gospel. And so we see that he had this friendship with Jesus, and he was actually the youngest of all the disciples. And so he writes in John 1, like in the kind of what we kind of look as the first chapter, but really the introduction to his entire gospel, he writes some really big, powerful things about Jesus. And this is how he describes Jesus in a very important way. John 1:14 and then 16 to 17. He says, the Word became flesh. So he refers to Jesus as the Word, and here's simply what he means. And I could do a whole 3-hour theological talk on what it means to be the Word. This is really, really powerful. But basically what he's saying is that Jesus was the full expression of the thoughts, plans, actions, feelings of God to people, to humanity, right? That Jesus, he was that full expression. The way our words express our thoughts, plans, actions, feelings, intentions to people, that Jesus was that, and he was in the flesh, so he kind of put on an earth suit, right? So the full expression of God to human beings put on a body. And these disciples experienced him. John experienced this, and this is what he says. He says he became flesh and took up residence among us. Literally, in the original language, the term there is that he had a tent right there, right? Like he lived in a tent right there next to us. We observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now again, grace and truth can be sometimes at opposite ends of the spectrum, and we're going to look at that a little bit. Maybe there's people that are really, you're like, oh no, I'm a grace person, love everybody, everybody gets to do whatever they want, grace, grace, grace. And then there's people over here that are like truth, 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 and this, and they sometimes seem at odds. But Jesus, it says, was full of, not the balance of grace and truth, but the full embodiment of grace and truth, this tension that exists there. Indeed, he goes on further to say, indeed, we have all received grace after grace from his fullness. Our experience with him was grace after grace. For the law was given through Moses. And we've talked about before how Jesus spoke of this law of Moses. And he was a Jewish man in a Jewish world with a Jewish message. So he had to address Torah, the law. And we see how he addressed that. And he actually viewed the law in light of himself. So for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So there was this new thing that he was doing. Jesus was living in this tension of grace and truth, and he embodied it in a powerful way. And they said that when we saw him, what we were seeing was God, this full expression of who God is in our lives. Beautiful, beautiful words there. And it kind of leads us to our idea worth discussing. What I want to discuss today is Jesus leads us to embrace God's grace and God's truth and refuse to let go of either. It's the idea of we don't pick a side. No, we hold on to both. And we figure out, how do we live in that tension? How do we live where sometimes we're just not sure what to say in that situation? We know what the truth is, but we know what grace is, and we're trying to figure out, how do we approach this situation? And this situation may be different than this situation. And we live in that tension, and we're stretched, and we're pulled, and it hurts, and it's dangerous, and it's risky. But we refuse to let go of either, because I'll tell you this, comfort and tribe and all the security comes with picking a side, right? Just try to say something in the middle of a situation on Facebook, and you'll find that comfort actually lies on a side, being certain of what you know to be true, rather than living in that tension between grace and truth. So, the problem is this, the people who stand on the too much grace side suffer from liberalism. And here's what I mean by that. I'm not talking politically here. I mean, and there's also another word is licentiousness, but that just makes me sound like I'm trying to be smarter than everybody, so I didn't want to use that word. Liberalism, right? It's the idea that, no, everybody just gets to do whatever they want and be okay. But then when you're hurt, you understand that doesn't necessarily always fly, right? Or if there's a gross injustice going on, that doesn't always fly. That just anybody can do whatever they want. I heard a guy say one time about this is that, yeah, like everyone, it's great. Everyone just be yourself, do whatever you want to do until the Nazi walks in the room. And then everyone's like, no, you don't get to do whatever you want to do, right? So it's a little unbalanced. It's an unbalanced way to live, right? It's not a full perspective of the world that we live in, and understanding that people hurt people, and there are things that are wrong, and there are injustices, and there are things that we have to stand up against, and we don't just let everyone do whatever they want. But sometimes it feels like that with grace. We've had people in this discussion here as we talk about grace just go, that just doesn't sound right. Right? It's real scandalous because no one deserves grace. As soon as you deserve it, it's not grace anymore, but it makes us feel sometimes, again, that tension there. But too much truth leads to legalism. And maybe that's your church background. It was, oh, Jesus loves you. The grace of God is there for you. He died for you. He loves you no matter what, just the way you are. Come to Jesus. And you're like, yeah, I want to follow Jesus. And I'm like, okay, now here's your list of rules to follow so that you can actually be a good Christian. Here's all the things to do. You see those people and the way they didn't say it this way, but the way they're faking, right? You go just fake like them, and then we'll all be able to accept each other. And it becomes legalism. And the idea is that the grace of God didn't save us. It's what are we doing in our life to earn that? Not to live from grace, but to live for grace. And that's just not the way grace works. And so the too much truth side ends up being legalistic and adds to the gospel that says, no, Jesus has conquered sin and death, and you are all loved more than you could ever imagine, and he welcomes you in to relationship with God through himself. And so we know, again, these things can be at odds with each other, so we want to live in the tension. And Jesus gives us many, many examples. I want to go right into one just real quickly today and look at it for him to be our example. And again, maybe you don't follow Jesus, but you can listen in a little bit and maybe learn something from this example of living in the tension of grace and truth. So, Jesus, John chapter 8, verse 1, it says, Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early next morning he was back again at the temple. And the reason he was at the temple and where he was there was this feast. They called the Festival of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacle. And it basically was this. It was a giant Jewish campout. It was the idea of, remember when you lived in the wilderness in the 40 years, like after Egypt and before the Promised Land, there's this 40 years you lived in. We want to commemorate that, and they actually, this was like very few of the feasts and festivals they had were as exciting as this, like remembering that time there and God's grace through that entire thing. And so it was like a giant Jewish campout. They would leave their homes and they would throw up tents everywhere, and it would be a giant campout, which is going to be important as we get into this story here, okay? Because maybe you've been camping and you might relate. I don't know. We'll see. A crowd soon gathered. So he's at the temple teaching, and the day before this, a crowd gathered, and he had it out with some religious elite leaders, and they didn't like him, and he was being way smarter than them. And so a crowd gathered this next day, and he sat down and he taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees, right, so this group who doesn't like him, brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery, and they put her in front of the crowd. So he's teaching, and it's interrupted by probably a half-naked woman, or a woman maybe clutching onto clothes, trying to cover herself, being thrown into the dirt at his feet in the middle of this. And this is what he said. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery." Now, I always wonder, like, where was the guy? Because it takes two to tango, and to have sex, so both of those. And I always wonder where he is. But also, it's like this. It's like, if you realize what the Feast of Booths was, this probably was all too common, with everybody's tents together, and it's a party. Maybe you go into the wrong tent, right? Okay? No, I'm serious. Like, these are real people. I want to connect what is true to what is real. These are real people. And so they grab this woman, and they throw it. And the law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. And Jesus does something I think we could all learn from kind of in Facebook. He kind of just ignores them, right? Maybe we would just be better off doing this. But Jesus stooped down and he wrote in the dust with his finger. And we don't know what he wrote. It's like one of the first questions I would ask Jesus, like if he were like to walk in, like, what were you writing? He just kind of ignores them. It says they kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and he said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, which I think is interesting. I wonder if that's the person who was, they maybe had a little wisdom with their age, a little experience, or maybe they just had a lot more sin, right? They just were like, yeah, never mind. Beginning with the oldest, until Jesus was the only one left in the middle of the crowd with the woman, which is a beautiful picture because one of the things that we believe about Jesus in his life was that he was sinless, right? And so it was like there was this woman who was caught in the act of adultery, right? Like by the law, she was proven to be guilty. It was pretty easy. And then there were these guys who were religious elite. They were the best of the best. When it came to being moral and following the law, these guys got it. And then there was Jesus who again, would the experience the disciples had was that he was blameless. He was sinless. And so we see the three different levels there. And so the only one left that could throw a stone was Jesus. He stood up again and he said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." I'm not going to condemn you. Go and sin no more. So he does this thing that I think is really subtle, but it's really important. He acknowledges that what she did was wrong. He calls it sin. And so some people in psychology want to call this ego self, right? Like there's various names, and it really comes down to the same thing. It's this thing that hurts us and hurts others in our actions. And maybe you're in here and you've experienced the hurt of adultery in your life in some way, a family member, yourself. Maybe you were cheated on. You've been there. And so you know that's not what's best in life, right? That's not the highest way to live life. And you understand that pain. You understand, yeah, she should probably stop that. There's probably people, maybe kids, maybe husbands, people who love her, counting on her, and this hurts them. So Jesus doesn't ignore the sin. He just doesn't condemn her. He doesn't condemn the person. He sets her free. Go, sin no more. Change your life. Move in a different direction. And I think he gives us two ways here to really how to hold on to grace and truth at the same time. How to live in the tension. And these are simple, but they're very, very difficult. And so this is what I want us to kind of discuss and hash out in our life today. The first one is this: refuse condemnation and choose kindness. Refuse condemnation and choose kindness. The idea, I'm not going to condemn people. It's not my role. And you know, one of the New Testament authors, I love what he says in kind of like the middle of one of his letters to the church. He says, by the way, those who find themselves in Jesus, who follow Jesus or trusting Jesus in faith, there's no condemnation there in Christ Jesus. He's taken care of that. There's no judgment. There's no condemnation. And so refuse condemnation and choose kindness. Because I think that's what Jesus did here. As the only person there who could do that, he refused to do it. And instead he chose to love. And I wonder if he asked himself in that scenario, or at least demonstrated what we talked about last week, how should I love in this person with this situation? How should I love? And then next, refuse comparison and choose consideration. Comparison is a trap. Have you ever experienced that? Because what we end up doing is we refuse to compare ourselves to people who are better than us, and we love to compare ourselves to people we know that don't measure up to us, maybe to whatever standard that we've set up. It's just interesting. Imagine a world where instead of comparing ourselves to each other, we just considered everyone as better than ourselves. We just considered everyone as better. Because then at that point, no longer are we comparing ourselves, because we've already settled in our mind that compared to me, this person is just better, and so I'm going to consider them better. And another New Testament writer tells us that that's the way to unity and love, is that humility of just considering this other person as better than ourselves. Imagine if we lived life like that, where we just considered others as better automatically. Humbling ourselves. Yeah, but what about this? No. What if we just stopped comparing and just started considering that other person across from the table from us? That person at work that we can't stand. If you follow Jesus, this is the pattern. You see, what he did to them was, compared to them, she was this awful sinner. He turned the tables of comparison on them and said, yeah, and compared to me, you're the same thing. and then he chose kindness over condemnation. What if we could follow Jesus in that kind of wisdom in our everyday interactions with each other, with our family, with that person that we can't stand, with that person that we really love? What if we began to be people? If you follow Jesus, we began to be people. That there's this church in the middle of downtown that, like, there's just something about the way they consider each other and the way they consider people in the neighborhood, the way they consider people in the community, just as better than themselves. There's just this humility that leads to this love and this grace like we've never seen before. That's what Jesus is calling us to. It's where we follow him if we follow him. And it's simply this. Grace given, grace accepted, grace extended, grace accepted. Right? What if we extended the grace that we wished to receive? Because we're all truth people, so we're the ones that are wrong, and then we turn into grace people. But what if we looked at God's grace and we accepted it? It's like in AA. There's 12 steps that really proven patterns where some life change. And again, maybe some of you have experienced that. You've been in programs like that. But step 0 is kind of like this. First, it's accepting that you're accepted there at the group. Right? Before you really get to step 1, it's accepting that you're accepted. And we call that faith. It's trusting, it's accepting that God has accepted you, that his grace is for you. And maybe you've never considered that before. And so when you accept that, like you're like, oh, I've been given grace and I don't deserve it. That's what makes it grace. And so I turn around and I begin to extend that to someone else. And then maybe they receive that grace and then they go, oh, wow, I didn't deserve that from that person. Maybe I can treat people like that because that was pretty outstanding. And it becomes this pattern of everyone showing each other grace and considering each other better than ourselves. In his book, Messy Grace, Caleb Kaltenbach, which is a phenomenal story. He has an unbelievable story. I will not get into it. I would just encourage each and every one of you to read this incredibly culturally relevant story that he talks about. And he says this: another name for the tension between grace and truth is love. It's only when we accept the demands of living in this tension that we can show the fullness of love to people. Deciding that we're going to hold on to God's grace and God's truth and refuse to let go of either. If you follow Jesus, this is where he is leading you to. It's where he is leading me to. And so we want to find that wisdom and that experience, and we want to look to him and say, how do I do that? And we want to grace each other when we fall in it, and we want to help each other do it. Because we can't do it on our own. We do it together. We hold on to grace and truth. Refuse to let go of either for the glory of God and the good of others. And that's the kind of church we want to be here. We want to live in that tension. We don't want to have hardline answers for people because sometimes hardline answers just don't do anyone any good. Because in that situation may be unique. And we want to walk in that tension between grace and truth.